Welcome to this short video from the Foundations in Neuroscience playlist. My name is Professor Phil Newton, and we're going to talk about motor pathways in this short video. What I hope you're able to do then by the end of the video is to be able just to describe the main motor pathways of the human nervous system. Let's start with a very basic outline. Let's say I want to enact a particular movement. Let's say I want to kick a ball. My brain decides what should happen. There are various different regions in the brain, and we'll talk through all those in a few slides' time. The motor command is then sent down my spinal cord, specifically down the descending spinal tracts of my spinal cord, and then the commands leave the spinal cord and go out through the spinal nerves to the muscles. Different spinal nerves leave the spinal cord at different segments. So let's say the spinal nerves that innervate my feet and my legs, they leave very low down from my spinal cord, whereas the spinal nerves that innervate the muscles of my arms that I'm going to hold out for balance, they leave higher up the spinal cord, and I'll show you a diagram of that again in a second. So I've decided I'm going to kick a ball. My brain decides what it wants to do. It sends the command down to my muscles. My muscles do their best. And then what has actually happened, the information about where my legs and arms have ended up and where the ball has ended up and all that sensory information then goes back in to the spinal cord and then goes back up to the brain. So there's a closed circuit loop. What I'm supposed to do, what actually happens, and then an ongoing correction process. But if, for example, I'm enacting an ongoing movement, let's say I'm walking or I'm talking. All right, let's start then at the bottom of this section. We're going to talk about reflex arcs. All movements that we enact involve one of these or more of these reflex arcs, and we'll show you a diagram of one in a bit more detail. Let's get the pointer up. Okay, so let's start. This is a sensory reflex arc. So let's say I've got sensory receptors in my skin. Let's say I pick up something that's too hot and I immediately drop it. The sensory information from the skin that is too hot, it then goes into my spinal cord through an afferent nerve. There are then various synapses in here, one of which is on then to an efferent motor neuron that leaves through the ventral root of the spinal cord and goes to the muscle or the various muscles, which would then cause me to drop that thing that was very hot. So if any sort of reflex that you make, be it a knee jerk, be it moving your hand away from something that's too hot or painful, involves one of these reflex arcs. Very basic, unconscious almost movement. You don't think about dropping something that's hot, you just do it. In the spinal reflex arc, then we have a sensory input and we have a motor output. And movements can and do happen without any other circuits being involved. However, all movements that we make, be they voluntary or reflex, involve one of these reflex arcs. So let's say I decide voluntarily to put down something that's a little bit too hot. This same reflex arc will be involved, but there will be some voluntary commands coming down from my brain to be able to do that. So as I said before, different regions of the body receive their motor input from different spinal cord segments depending on whereabouts in the body they are. So here we have a color-coded diagram of the spinal cord. From top, the head is up here, all the way down to the sacral segments down here. And the color code then corresponds to the regions of the body whose muscles are moved by the motor nerves that come from the corresponding colored section of the spinal cord. Similarly, the sensory information from these regions of the body comes into the same color-coded section of the spinal cord. Obviously, the spinal cord itself is not color-coded in real life. So here we have then the underside of the arm. The motor nerves that move the muscles here come from cranial segment number 8 and thoracic segment number 1, C8 and T1. And the sensory information from the skin and elsewhere on this part of the body comes into then the spinal cord from into C8 and into T1. So that's reflex arcs. Now let's go on to talk then about voluntary movements, when we decide when we want to make a particular movement. There are lots of different regions of the brain that are important for this. Perhaps the most important, or the one that most of the textbooks normally start with, is called the primary motor cortex. Here then in red is the primary motor cortex, also known as Brodmann area number 4. It's at the posterior end of the frontal cortex. Different regions of the primary motor cortex control different regions of the body. So if we were to take a slice through the primary motor cortex and rotate it through 90 degrees, there would be sections of the primary motor cortex that control, let's say, the tongue and the pharynx. These would be out on the outer surface, on the lateral surface of the primary motor cortex. And the parts of the primary motor cortex that control the legs, the feet, and the toes, those are towards the medial and the dorsal part of the primary motor cortex. There's obviously not these structures on the outer surface of the primary motor cortex. But what this shows you, what this idea of a homunculus shows you, is that there are big parts of the motor cortex dedicated to controlling, let's say, the muscles of the hand or the muscles of the face, the tongue, and the larynx. This is because these regions are required to and are able to engage in very complicated fine motor movements. Our hands are able to do very complex fine motor movements, and my ability to speak to you right now is as a result of very fine, discrete movements of my tongue, my pharynx, and so on. My knees, my hips, my feet, not quite as dexterous, not quite as able to engage in very fine movements. They're still able to move, but there's less processing power dedicated to moving them. All right, let's go on to some of the other major regions of the brain that are important for voluntary movements. Two of them are located in Brodmann area number 6. This shows you the outer or the lateral surface of Brodmann area number 6, and this then shows you the medial surface of the right hemisphere. And here highlighted in red is the medial surface of Brodmann area number 6. This is the same region, just loops up and then over into the medial portion of the hemisphere. On the lateral or the outer surface of Brodmann area number 6 is the premotor cortex, and then the region that's tucked up and over on the inside is the supplementary motor area. We're going to talk about what those do along with some other key regions. So the premotor cortex, very simply what it does is it assesses and processes the external environment. It takes note of where, let's say, the ball is and the goal and the other players on the pitch, let's say if I'm playing football. The supplementary motor area then prepares the plan. How it decides what's going to happen. I'm going to swing back my right leg. I'm going to balance my left leg. I'm going to stick my arms out to balance me, and then I'm going to swing my right leg forward, and I'm going to kick the ball. All of those plans are made in the supplementary motor area. The basal ganglia, then, these are deep regions shown here. You've got various of them, different subregions responsible for slightly different things, but very basically what they do together is they initiate movement and they suppress unwanted movement. The regions of the brain, particularly those that initiate movement and suppress unwanted movement, those are important in Parkinson's disease. So people with Parkinson's disease show a loss of a subpart of the basal ganglia called the substantia nigra, which means it's very difficult for them to initiate movements and for them to suppress movements that they don't want to happen. It's also difficult for them to stop moving once they've started. Finally, then, I'll just pause while you watch this through. This region right at the back and the base of the brain called the cerebellum, this is responsible for coordinating ongoing movement. So between them then, these regions together, the premotor cortex processes the external environment, the supplementary motor area makes the plan, the basal ganglia initiates the movement, and that all goes then down goes to the primary motor cortex, and it's then sent down the spinal tracts, and in particular the primary descending spinal tract that is known as the corticospinal tract. So here we have then the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex on the outer surface here, and it sends then these projections down through the internal capsule, this white matter tract, so it looks very white in anatomical preparations, down through the brainstem where it crosses over from one side to the other. This is called decussation. It simply means crossing over, and in particular it's called the decussation of the pyramids because these fibers arise in the pyramidal cells of the primary motor cortex. This happens basically on the back of the neck, and so then the right primary motor cortex controls the left-hand side of the body and vice versa. Finally, then we have these ascending spinal tracts. The information about what has happened, what has actually happened, goes back up to these important regions of the brain. There are two ascending spinal tracts in particular that are important, the dorsal columns and the spinocerebellar tract. The dorsal columns end up in the brainstem and then on to the thalamus and the motor cortical regions that we talked about, and the spinocerebellar tract obviously ends up in the cerebellum. Very simply, what these do is proprioception. They allow these motor regions and our brain in general to determine where we are in space and where different parts of our body are in space and relative to each other. Okay, a summary then. All movements use a spinal reflex arc. That includes involuntary reflex movements and voluntary movements. Voluntary movements arise in the primary motor cortex. There are other cortical regions that are involved, and they all send the information then onto the primary motor cortex, which then goes down the cortical spinal tracts, crossing over on the medulla and the decussation of the pyramids. The cerebellum then controls motor coordination in an ongoing way. So let's say we're walking or we're talking, the coordination of these movements and the planning of what's going to happen next and how that's coordinated with what has just happened, that requires the cerebellum. And sensory information is relayed back up through these ascending tracks to close the loop. That's it. Here are the credits for all the different images that we've used. As always, these are all open source images available via Wikimedia Commons. Any questions, send me an email, p.newton@swansea.ac.uk, and I'll see you in another video. Bye-bye.